Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another Live at 5. I am your host, Curator Kevin Adkisson with the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research. And today, I am coming to you live from Cranbrook House and Gardens. And when I decided on this topic, it was a lovely spring day here in Michigan. It has turned into a very lovely rainy day. So I thought that we would get our Live at 5 started, underway here inside the house, and then we'll move out to the gardens. Now, our subject today is a character who, though he is represented around Cranbrook House and Gardens quite extensively, he's not someone that I really regularly talk or think about. And when I chose this topic on the suggestion of our registrar, Leslie Mayo, I thought, okay, well, I sort of know a bit about all of the sculptures. This will be a fun and easy little Live at 5. And the more I researched Mario Korbel today on the internet and in the archives, the more I realized really how interesting and how extensive his work here at Cranbrook is. I think it's going to inspire a later blog post where I can really dig into the archival material. I thought there would be a little, there was actually a ton. And so let's get started by looking at one of the first Mario Korbels to come into George and Ellen Booth's collection, in one of the sculptures that repeats on the inside and the outside of the house. And so this lovely lady is named Dawn. She is from 1920, and she was sculpted by the Bohemian American sculptor Joseph Mario Korbel. He was born in 1882 in Osijek, Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. So he was born about 90 miles outside of Prague, and Korbel came to America in 1900 at the age of 18. He had already studied sculpture in Bohemia. He came to New York and then quickly moved to Chicago. But in 1905, he returned to Europe, where he then studied art in Berlin. He studied at the Royal Academy in Munich for 3 years, and then he studied at the Académie Julian in Paris. And he exhibited at the Paris Salon of 1909. And it was that year that he returned to the American Midwest. He returned to Chicago. And for the next 4 or 5 years, he would have a pretty robust career as a very popular funereal and civic sculptor around the Midwest. And so he traveled between Chicago and Denver and St. Louis, making different memorials and sculptures. Probably his most famous early American work is the Black Angel of Iowa City, which you can look it up on Google. It is sort of haunting. It's a funeral monument that was commissioned for a father and son, so the angel's wings go across 2 graves. He then goes to New York in 1913, where he sets up a studio in association with the Roman Bronze Foundry. And everything that I'm going to show you today was sculpted by Mario Korbel, and if it is bronze, it was cast at the Roman Bronze Foundry in Manhattan. Now, I don't know exactly how George Booth and Mario Korbel ended up becoming first, I think, patron clients and then friends, but as we'll see in today's Live at 5, they had a pretty extensive relationship. And one of the pieces that was pretty early into George Booth's collection was this figure of Dawn. George Booth wanted it by Christmas 1923. The sculpture, again, is 1920. And he ordered this smaller copy for Christmas and then requested to have a larger edition, which we'll see outside, of 1924. And it came with this marble base, which became, in the letters between Korbel and George Booth in archives, issue of great concern as George Booth was waiting for the larger figure of Dawn to arrive, and he kept asking Korbel, is the proportion the same? Can I have my mason carve a base for the bigger statue directly at scale between these two? Now, I'll talk a little bit more about Korbel in 1923, but one of the sculptures that got him famous a little bit earlier than that is from 1916. And it wasn't this exact sculpture. This is a 1926 edition of that earlier piece. In 1916, picture these two lovely dancers without the hanging fabric. One actually had her arm outstretched holding a little building. The other had her arm in holding a little sculpture. And it was actually originally carved as an allegory of architecture and sculpture in a dance. And if that seems like something that would have interested George Booth, you are absolutely correct. We know that George Booth loved allegorical sculpture, he loved allegorical art, and he loved the arts and crafts movement, which was something that Mario Korbel was a part of in the American Midwest, in which he commemorated in his 1916 sculpture of architecture and sculpture dancing. Now, a year later, he gets, you could say, a little less heavy-handed, and he resculpts the group as andante, which is what we see here, or a medium-slow dance. And with the andante, he removes the small building, he removes the small sculpture, and he adds these hanging fabric drapery. And it's very interesting, the essay that I read from the Metropolitan Museum of Art talked about the transition from it being an allegorical sculpture to being a sort of modern dance sculpture with this andante title, and that he's really blending together Greek classical sculpture with modern French sculpture and abstraction. Now, as I mentioned, this is a 1926 casting. There are two phases of casting. He does it in 1916. He does the version with the hanging drapery in 1917. And then he reissues it in 1926, which is the point when George Booth acquires his. What's interesting about the model for these pieces, it's one model. Her name was Hilda Bayer, and she was a dancer in New York. She then became Mario Korbel's lover and then his wife. They divorced in 1924, but she served as the model for many of his early or sort of mid-career figures. And so it's interesting that the most common motif in Korbel's work is to sculpt sort of classically inspired nude dancers, and then he married one of his muses, Hilda, who we see here. Now, from this piece, I want to take a brief walk into the library, because remember, George Booth doesn't get this piece until 1926, but it was Korbel's most famous work, and it is probably the work that introduced Korbel to George Booth. Like either he saw it at the Met, or he saw it at one of the big galleries in New York where it was displayed, or he just saw it in publications, because it was widely published as sort of this great American work of sculpture. And so, in 1918, if we look up here, we will see somewhere, I did not actually find it before Live at 5, so we will find it together, along the east wall, in these carvings by Johann Kirschmeyer, we can see here, carved in wood, the same two figures of andante dancing. So, again, as I mentioned at the start of this Live at 5, I feel like the story of Mario Korbel is both more extensive and more interesting than I initially gave it credit for. And so hopefully through the blog or through further research, I can maybe sort out what the initial connection is, because it is interesting that we have a wood carving after a bronze sculpture that George Booth didn't own but would eventually own about a decade before he actually acquires the initial bronze. Now, George Booth, as we know, loved bronzes. It was his favorite thing to collect. He gave a big portion of his collection to the Detroit Institute of Arts in the 19-teens and the 1920s. But there is no one represented more in George Booth's collection than Mario Korbel. And so you'll see another one is sitting here on the table. This is the wonderful Adam and Eve bowl of 1920. This one was exhibited at the Detroit Society of Arts and Crafts. The order of it for that exhibit was coordinated by Helen Plum, who was the secretary of the society and one of George Booth's good friends. You can see that it's signed Mario Korbel 1920 number 1. And in the archives, Mario Korbel is constantly apologizing to Mr. Booth that he cannot give Mr. Booth the first edition of a piece because it's already been sold to so-and-so collector. But in this case, George Booth did get the first edition. And unlike Carl Millis, who sort of would never promise how many editions there were, Korbel took the more American approach of really commodifying his works by having low editions. So a piece like this might only have 15 or 25 editions. I'm not actually sure how many Adam and Eve bowls there are, but there are 4 scenes of the story of Adam and Eve wrapped around the base of the bowl with these wonderful sort of twisted columns below. Here we see the apple being exchanged between the 2 figures. And then as we move our way around, what's happening here? I'm not sure exactly what's happening in this one. But there are these 4 sort of scenes from the book of Genesis here around the Adam and Eve bowl. Now, there are additional works of Korbel around Cranbrook House. There's some upstairs that are in the president's office. There's some more down here, but I want to move to 2 that were sculpted by Mario Korbel here at Cranbrook. So I mentioned that 1923 was a pivotal year in the relationship of George Booth and Korbel, because it was that year that they met in New York and that George Booth invited Korbel to come to Cranbrook, to Detroit. Korbel was doing a large commission in New Orleans that spring, and he injured his hand, and he actually had to stop sculpting for most of the spring of 1923. He recovers using what he called an old bohemian home remedy of herbs rubbed across his hand. George Booth sort of snarkily remarks that, these mystic remedies might work, but he also might consider coming up to the sanatorium at Battle Creek. And Korbel is headed to Battle Creek to try and heal his hand when his hand heals itself through that bohemian remedy. And so he visits Detroit in July of 1923. He meets George Booth down at the Detroit News Building, and they drive up here to Cranbrook together. And George Booth, in that September, hammers out a proposition that he will give Mario Korbel $500 a month, which is a pretty substantial sum, for the next year, for a full year, if Mario Korbel will complete 2 busts and 3 figures for the garden, and do at least 2 to 3 months of their work here at Cranbrook. At the time, George Booth did not have any artist studios at Cranbrook, and so part of the contract is worded that those 2 to 3 months of work at Cranbrook will only be executed if George Booth is able to provide adequate sculpture studios for Mario Korbel. If not, they'll be done in his New York or London studio. What's interesting is George Booth does assemble the studio, but Korbel only ends up staying about 3 weeks here at Cranbrook. And in that 3 weeks, he starts the carving, he starts the preliminary work of 2 sculpture busts, which are now here in the Oak Room. And one is of George Booth himself, we are seeing the marble edition here. There's also a bronze casting. And it seems like in the archives that there are actually multiple bronzes, and I don't know where the other bronzes are, but they were cast at Korbel's request because he thought that this was such a striking likeness, and he wanted to use this bust of George Booth in order to gain further commissions. Korbel was a remarkably successful commercial sculptor, and I think part of it was his sort of business savvy when he created a likeness that was beloved by his client and that was such a striking work of sculpture. He went to that expense to say, can I cast yet another bronze and use it essentially as a showpiece? There's also letters and archives going back and forth about ordering a matching pair of spectacles for the bust. And George Booth did do that and shipped them to New York. So I don't know if those were purchased for the bronze version, which does have glasses, or if they were sitting on the marble sculpture. That seems pretty unlikely. Either way, George Booth had to get a second pair of his glasses and ship them to the sculptor in New York. The other person whom Korbel sculpted in that brief 1923 visit was Henry Woodbouth. And this was sculpted in the last year of Henry Woodbouth's life. This is George's father. And so it was sculpted shortly before his death. And we're seeing the marble version here. Now, there was also a bronze version cast. And again, I don't know where that bronze version is. So if any of the Booth's family members are watching and you know where the bronze of Henry Woodbouth is, that would be interesting to know. It is a little surprising that it's not here at Cranbrook, but I do know that it was these marbles which were kept on permanent display. Now, I want to next head outside where we will look at 3 additional Mario Korbel statues. And the relationship between Korbel and George and Ellen Booth would continue on through the 1920s. The correspondence sort of ends by the 1930s. What's interesting is, Korbel has that pretty amazing contract of doing sculptures for George Booth and having that $500 stipend. But it seems like he doesn't actually need the money or the commissions because he ends up relinquishing the contract. But they all stay friends with each other, and the Korbels actually come and spend Christmas 1923 here at Cranbrook House with the Booths. And the last of Korbel's sculptures will be delivered to Cranbrook in 1928. And those of you who are, big Cranbrook fans, big Live at 5 fans, know that by 1928, we are intersecting with the opening of the Cranbrook Arts and Crafts Studios and the founding of the Cranbrook institutions. And so I think Mario Korbel, he has this kind of unique position within the history of Cranbrook because, his visit here and his studio here was 1923. His sculptures on campus, sculpted for campus, are all done in 1923. And that's well before George Booth has started any of the institutions. In the letters back and forth, George Booth is very much interested in the meeting house and opening what was called the Bloomfield Hills Seminary, which was the precursor to Brookside School. But George Booth was not thinking that he was going to open up an art academy or open up this sort of much grander, much more ambitious campus that Carl Millis would become, of course, the sculptor for. And so Korbel could sort of be seen as this proto-sculptor in residence. And where his residence was in this little studio pavilion, which was an open-air sort of picnicking house added into the garden of Cranbrook House in the 19-teens. And then it was enclosed for Mario Korbel's 1923 residency. Again, I am a little bit fuzzy on the details of how much time Mario Korbel actually spent here. It seems like, from what I got through in the archives, he was only here about 3 weeks. And in that time, he sculpted the portrait bust in marble of George and Henry Booth, or he began those portrait busts here. We do have the records of the shipment of those busts going from Cranbrook to New York and then from New York back to Cranbrook. So he finished them in his main New York studio. And I'm not sure he ever came back and actually worked in this little pavilion studio here. I wonder if, George Booth had provided Korbel what he would eventually provide Carl Millis, which was 3 full studios. I'm sure Korbel would have been a much more engaged and a much bigger part of the Cranbrook story. Instead, we are left with 3 Korbel sculptures around the Cranbrook grounds, Cranbrook House grounds. Of course, there are no Carl Millis sculptures here at Cranbrook House. We're seeing 3. There were 5 commissioned. 2 were never delivered. The first piece that we're encountering here on Live at 5 today is the sculpture of what we call Ecolo, short for ecology, but what Korbel and George Booth called Atalanta, the Greek goddess of the hunt. And Atalanta was sculpted in a piece of white marble that George Booth actually picked out and shipped to Korbel's studio. And we have the shipment records in Cranbrook archives. And so this piece was delivered to Korbel's studio on the Upper East Side on Madison Avenue in 1928. It came back to Cranbrook in 1929 or 1930. And George Booth actually became very concerned for her. And if you can see the condition that she is in, I think he was correct to be concerned for her safety. He found the marble to be just so beautifully white and luminous, but also so fragile and delicate. And he decided that it would not be wise to place her in the garden, but instead he moved her into the first show at the Cranbrook Art Museum, which was in 1930. And so Atalanta served as the original sort of show-stopping piece in the very middle of the first Cranbrook Art Museum exhibit in 1930, which was held in the building that's now the Cranbrook Academy of Art Administration building. But of course, 1930, that was before Cranbrook Academy of Art was even an entity. And so Atalanta was there in the museum in 1930, and in 1931 or thereabouts, she was moved to the Kingswood Dormitory Terrace. And in 1969, vandals approached Atalanta and shattered her. So they pushed her off the pedestal, and she broke into quite a lot of pieces. I'm not sure how she was reattached. I think we would do it very differently today in 2021 than they did in 1969. And we are seeing that the sort of purity of the marble is really quite interrupted by the repair job. I think Cranbrook has many needs, and poor little Icalo is probably low on the priority list, but it would be wonderful one day to redo this repair. Now, once she was rebuilt, Henry Scripps Booth, George and Ellen's youngest son, who was also involved in the Cranbrook House Gardens and in the preservation of his parents' legacy, he renamed Atalanta to Icalo, short for ecology. And he wrote a little poem, which you can read on your next visit to Cranbrook House and Gardens, Herb Garden. And Henry both wrote, Icalo, goddess of earth, who is this sweet maid who stoops protectively to save the earth from man's pernicious tread? It is the blithe spirit of ecology, by whom all life and natural things are fed. And so Henry Booth sort of transforms the goddess of the hunt into this symbol of environmental awareness and ecological protection. So the damaged goddess has returned in a new form to represent, I think, the sort of damaged planet. Now, of course, the gardens are just coming to life after a long and tiring winter. And you'll see here that the Herb Society of Michigan is tending to their beautiful herb garden here, part of the Cranbrook House and Gardens Auxiliary. Our next Mario Korbel is down a little ways. And what was interesting in the archives, reading the letters, was how much Korbel was involved in the design of the terraces here. And this, again, sort of really piqued my interest when I was reading this an hour ago, because we really don't associate any sculptor with these terraces. We have 3 or 4 different landscape architects and gardeners who we say, helped contribute. Of course, George Booth was involved. But reading these letters, Mario Korbel was suggesting really very specific things about the gardens. He was making suggestions on the type of balustrade, which George Booth would then execute. He was making suggestions about the dimensions of these terraces and how they would connect with each other. And so I really think that, this future research project that I now want to embark on will probably tell us much more about the sort of formation of the terraced gardens around Cranbrook House and how Mario Korbel, this Czech-American sculptor, was involved in their creation. One thing that is referenced in the letters is a sculpture group that would be created new for the garden. It was never realized, but Korbel references a series of photographs he sent to George Booth, and he suggested that George Booth take the photographs into the garden and set them up and photograph the photographs in the terrace so that they could get the scale of the figures right. Now, to my knowledge, that did not happen, but one of the figures that is here in the garden by Korbel is the beautiful Dawn, which is where we began our Live at 5 in the Cranbrook House sunset porch. And now we revisit the much larger Dawn here in the gardens, in what is known as the birthday garden. And here the figure of Dawn is very often holding flowers. I do not know who among you is coming out and putting the flowers in her hand. I have my suspicions. I do sort of appreciate the gesture, though I hope we're always safe towards the sculpture. Generally, we do not like or allow climbing in fountains. So Dawn here is, of course, at the much larger scale, and Korbel was quite interested in his figures at these larger scales. In fact, in the case of Andante, he actually donated to the Met a larger version of Andante because he thought the larger version was better than the small version they purchased. And so I think George Booth probably agreed with Korbel that the lovely little Dawn from the Christmas of 1923 was nice, but he wanted this much larger figure of Dawn for the garden. Now, she is holding an apple behind that rhododendron, and she's covered in the beautiful drapery. Again, this combination of sort of Greek classical nude with French modern sculpture that was sort of Korbel's main way of producing works. All of his sculptures are these sort of beautiful classical nude female figures with drapery. And it was a distinct commercial success to do this sort of updated version of classical sculpture. Now, behind Dawn is this stairway fountain, which is currently turned off. But this is the original stairway up to the house. And so George Booth expanded the terrace quite significantly, the lower terrace. And so as he expanded the terrace, he enclosed that original stairway. He expanded it out with a lovely piece of ironwork designed by George Booth, and then incorporating these Byzantine-style columns within the new concrete step terrace, and Dawn overseeing all of it. Now, she's looking due north, so I'm not sure she actually ever sees the dawn sun, but it's the name that counts. Plus, the Booths love to rename their sculptures anyways, so who knows what all they called this lovely little sculpture. Now, next we're going to head over to the West Terrace for our last Mario Korbel installation. So if anyone has any questions while I walk over there, I'd be happy to answer them. The last Mario Korbel sculpture that we'll see is Harmony, which is also probably my favorite and the most beautiful. Korbel lived until 1954. He died in New York. I'm not actually sure what he did for the latter years of his career. Most of his works are dated in the 1920s, or most of his later works are 1920s. He did become a metal artist, so he designed different medals, commemorative coins and tokens, and it does seem like he continued to do portrait bust. But his relationship with George Booth and with Cranbrook is really over by 1928, when the figure of Harmony, or music, or sonata, depending on what you want to call her, was finally delivered. And this sculpture is one of many names, and we can see her now as we approach the West Terrace. And she had so many names because she was part of George Booth's reimagining of this portion of his estate into what George Booth called the Terrace of the Arts. And George Booth came up with that name, the Terrace of the Arts, in 1923. And again, it's an interesting point in Cranbrook's history because George Booth is still really actively working on his house and gardens, but he very quickly, within the next 18 months of designing the Terrace of the Arts, will switch entirely over to envisioning the new sort of community of the arts. And we can see the art museum peeking through the trees over there. And so music or harmony or sonata is sort of looking at the future of what Cranbrook will become. And she is the sort of last major piece added to Cranbrook House and Gardens, the private estate of George and Ellen Booth. And after her commission, George and Ellen really won't engage with any major changes to Cranbrook House. At this point, by 1924, they have visited the American Academy in Rome. They have begun discussions for the establishment of Christ Church Cranbrook, and very shortly they will be off to the races building the 6 Cranbrook institutions, and they will stop work on Cranbrook House and Gardens. And so music here was to be one of 3 arts represented on the Terrace of the Arts. George Booth sent a sketch to Mario Korbel in New York about this terrace. And so George Booth designed this stairway leading up to the other terrace. And in the center, he wanted a standing figure of music. And then on this side, he wanted a reclining figure of architecture. And on this side, he wanted a reclining figure of sculpture. He commissioned Korbel to do all of them, but Korbel said he was a little bit busy and he could only accept the commission for music at that time, and they would come back and revisit architecture and sculpture. They never did. To my knowledge, this patio, this terrace, has always been called the West Terrace, and it was never the name Terrace of the Arts never stuck, probably because it took 5 years between commission to delivery for this figure of harmony to arrive. So she finally arrived in 1928, which is the same time that Booth was opening the Arts and Crafts Studios, that he was working on the boys' school in Kingswood. And so she sort of arrives a little bit late for his vision of the Terrace of the Arts. Now, in George Booth's sketch, which I'm going to post as a comment because I took a picture of it in archives, in his sketch, he proposes that music would be standing up, overlooking straight ahead to the pools. And in the letters with Korbel going back and forth about the figure of music, or harmony, Korbel eventually suggests that she should be seated, and then the final figure is looking up towards the heavens instead of straight ahead. She has this lyre or harp, and she sort of is observing. It reminds me of the Orpheus Fountain, which is another sculpture group of exalting music. But it's this, I don't know if it is a motif or if it is just in these 2 instances, where music is implied by sort of the motion, this sort of observing the heavens with the hands held in exaltation. And so it is this sort of, you look at the figure and you can almost hear that last strum of the harp as she is in this sort of moment in the sonata, listening to the note hang in the air. Again, it is this combination of sort of Greek classicism and French modern sculpture. And again, we have a beautiful nude. This time, the model for the figure was Alma Gluck, who, if you don't know Alma Gluck, she was a famous Romanian Jewish soprano who was one of the first great recording stars, famous for her 2 million albums sold of Take Me Back to Old Virginia, or whatever the proper title of that song is. So she was an early recording artist. She was famous on the American stage and then an early recording artist. She passed away in the 1930s. She sat for Mario Korbel in 1924 as the model for harmony, music, sonata, whatever you want to call our beautiful figure. Now, George Booth originally envisioned that it would be a more elaborate fountain. As we can see, it's a kind of a small little spray of water that splashes up along the base here. And of course, harmony, music, sonata, whatever the triple name we want to use, looks out across over to the 3-shell fountain and then the art museum beyond. So it does intrigue me that we are beginning and ending our Live at 5 with sculpture groups that are allegories of architecture, sculpture, and music, whether that's the Andante dancing girls inside, which were, of course, originally allegorical sculptures about architecture and sculpture, are out here, where we have Harmony, and she was originally going to be flanked by architecture and sculpture. I think it fits very well within George Booth's sort of design passion of the 19-teens and early 1920s, whether that was the Overmantel by Johann Kirschmeyer celebrating the arts and crafts, or his commission of the arts and crafts tapestry from the Herder looms that would be changed into a World War I tapestry. George Booth really was intent on transforming his English arts and crafts style home into this celebration of the arts and crafts, where it not only would be architecturally in the work of Albert Kahn, this celebration of handcrafted materials and of sort of English arts and crafts styling, but then within the sculptures around the house, he would also celebrate the sort of interaction of the arts, architecture, sculpture, and music here along the stairway. Now, I saw a couple of questions go by. Daryl asked how much it would be to fix the white marble sculpture. You know, I don't actually know. Today in art conservation, the number one rule is things should always be reversible. And so if you fix a painting or fix a broken sculpture, you should always be able to undo it. 1969, that was the professional practice, but I'm not sure that she's reversible. So if it's impossible to delaminate those corrections, how she was glued together, it is probably impossible to fix the sculpture. It would be a pretty extensive job to essentially remove all of those repairs from 1969 and redo it. So how much would it cost? Probably a lot. It would be really quite an endeavor to get her looking a more modern repair job and closer to Korbel's intent. And then the other question I saw is Sleeping Zeus Crying Zeus functioning? He is. So if you come and visit, you can see Crying Zeus over on the mountain, and he is crying again. Thanks so much for joining me for this little walk around the Cranbrook House and Gardens with a focus on the work of Mario Korbel. If you're just joining Live at 5, we have been doing this for over a year, 14 months. I have done earlier tours of Cranbrook Gardens as well as tours of Cranbrook House. So if anything I said today seemed confusing, or if you saw something and said, why did you walk past that? Scroll back in time and enjoy some of those earlier Live at 5 tours that go in depth into the house and gardens and their collections. I should be back next week with another fascinating topic. As always, you can send us a message here at the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research Facebook page about what you would like to see featured on Live at 5. I'll leave you with this view of Harmony by Mario Korbel, sculpted in 1924, delivered in 1928, overlooking the West Terrace of Cranbrook House. I neglected to mention that we actually have two versions of Harmony. There is a small bronze that was also on display in Cranbrook House. It's now in the Art Museum Collections wing. And so she is represented twice here on the campus. As always, it has been a pleasure being here with you, coming live from the Cranbrook campus. I am your curator, Kevin Adkisson, outstanding in the rain with this very broken Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research umbrella that I'm going to throw away when I get back home. And I will be back next week for another Live at 5. Thanks, everyone.